All right, guys, and we are at the top of the hour. I want to thank you guys so much for hanging out with me this afternoon to talk about change management for next generation 911. I want to let everybody know that this session is being recorded, and I encourage you to engage and interact with me as much as you can. Please use the Q&A window or the chat window for any questions that you have. I will take your questions as they come in, because not only am I the presenter, but I'm also the moderator for this session. So I have the ability to do whatever I want. So please use the Q&A, use the chat. If you've got a question, more than likely somebody else has the same question. This is a topic that is really important to me and has really kind of helped propel my career over the past 4 or 5 years. But before we get into that, I want to introduce myself, guys. My name is Drew Fiorinelli. I am a GISP. I'm also one of the business development managers for Datamark. I spent the first 13, now 15 years of my career in local government GIS. I have been a GIS tech. I have been a specialist. I've been an analyst. I have been a director. And I stay close to GIS-1 in my current role here at Datamark, but I'm also the president of the Geospatial Information and Technology Association. Some of my old school, older GIS folks like me may have heard of GITA or GITA, or Geospatial Information and Technology Association. It is a global nonprofit that has been around for 30 years and exists to support, educate, advocate, and connect geospatial professionals all across the planet. However, I am only the president of the North America chapter. So if you guys are interested in looking into that, please go to GITA.org and check it out. I think you'll love it. I'm a former volunteer firefighter, and I'm also responsible for building the GIS program for the city of Asheboro, North Carolina. Not only did I get the great opportunity to do that, but I got to handle all of the challenges that came with being the first ever GIS hire for a city. How many of you guys were and are currently the only GIS person for your locality? That's just one hat that you wear. I know, I love the hands coming up. It's amazing. I tell you, what was great about going to conference is really using that as an icebreaker or a way to connect with people, because we always understood kind of where each other was at and our processes and our challenges and our successes, and we were able to celebrate that together. So that was always a lot of fun. Although we'd always get back to our office and look at the list and the stack of things that we had to do and realize we were the only person there to do it. So that was always a lot of fun. All right, guys, today we're going to talk about change management and change management for next generation 911. I got to tell you, this is a topic that has been very powerful for me. And this presentation itself is actually the manifestation and inspiration of a guy named Dave Schneider, who used to work at Esri. He was one of their change management guys, and I found myself at the Esri UC in a session that he was presenting, and change management as a topic really resonated well for me. And I've kind of stayed close to what change management is over the past 5 years, 4 or 5 years. And I put it into these different boxes and into these different categories, depending on where my career is at, where my personal life is going, where I would like to go. And then as we started diving more and more into next generation 911, it felt like a great fit for NG9-1-1 in developing a sense of process or a sense of purpose or a sense of pathway for handling next generation 911. Because as you guys know, NG9-1-1 can create a lot of challenge, create a lot of unique just things, right? And for the longest time, I really didn't know how to compartmentalize that. And then I started referring back to what I'd learned with change management. But I also understand that culture is a big part. Culture is a big part of change or not change. And when we're dealing with 911 communities and GIS communities, we understand that we each have our own unique culture that's typically defined by a collective set of values or habits that we're conditioned to as people within the organization, right? We all have something in common. We're either all in 911, all in public safety, all in GIS, or all of the above. And so we know some things about each other just because we're in those communities, and that's culture. So culture happens either by default or by design, and it's natural for us to assimilate into whatever that culture is, whether we're new to the environment, we're changing the environment, or slowly we just kind of meld into the environment, right? GIS becoming a more integral part of 911, we will start to see some cultural emergences happen over the past, over the next several years, if you haven't already experienced them. We'll talk about some of those throughout this presentation. But we have to understand that successful leaders shape their cultures instead of allowing the cultures to shape the community. Now, that's really important because we need our leaders to help define where we're going to go so that we're not just floating along and just kind of bouncing back and forth against different manifestations that are going to take us down different paths. We need to know where we're starting and we need to know where we're going. And that's where our leaders and our thought leaders come into play while keeping culture in the back of our head. Now, leaders who do this best treat culture as a business strategy with an ongoing commitment to continually refine the culture in response to major changes within the organization, to strategy and culture. Next Generation 911 fits perfectly right in that sentence. Because for me, NG9-1-1 is creating a relatively massive change to these cultures, both 911 and GIS. So while we may not see or want cultural change, we have to know that cultural shaping is going to occur, which means it's got a starting point and has a defined or desired direction to head. Next Generation 911 helps us frame that really well. And I'll encourage you guys to check out the 4 principles of culture change. That's where this came from. And I thought this quote fit really well for this conversation on change management and Next Generation 911. So while we talk about change management, but how does change really impact culture? Well, Wade Davis stated that change is no threat to culture. And while I 100% completely agree with Wade, change is inevitable and culture shaping will occur. And can everybody pick out my misspelling? Thanks, guys. So while change is no threat to culture, we have to acknowledge that culture shaping will occur. So that allows us to maintain who we are and identify with our communities while evolving to incorporate technological advancements, these types of changes that we know are going to impact and improve our communities and our service. Right, so as we start talking about Next Generation 911, or you guys have already been talking about Next Generation 911, you're going to at some point bounce or come across an immovable object. Sometimes that's a person, sometimes that's a standard, sometimes that's a process. A lot of times it's a combination of all 3. And that can be really hard to deal with. You can either throw your hands up, say forget about it, and wait till you're forced into making a decision to move forward. That's really not where you want to be, though. You want to identify why you have this immovable object in front of you and why you can't get around it, or why you can't identify how to acknowledge and hear and understand the unique issues or problems that this person, this thing, this standard has, and develop a way to shape, shift, change, to incorporate why and move forward, right? That's the biggest part of change, is change doesn't occur because someone or something doesn't want it to happen, because it's uncomfortable. It means stepping out of a comfort zone, or it's a complete change without a whole bunch of things behind you. And we're going to get into it that are going to help make the transition of the process even easier. So change management comes into play a lot right here. And so change is part of any cultural shift, any cultural shift, shaping of, or evolution. I think we can all acknowledge that change is going to create a difference somewhere, right? Whether it's a shift, a shaping of, so reshaping our culture, or evolving our culture to incorporate change. And how we manage that change will really determine how successful we are in moving forward and sustaining the desirable change or desirable outcome. That's important because it's the difference between moving faster or moving slower or moving at all. Managing that change will determine how successful we are in moving forward and sustaining the desired change. That is a big point here. It's a big key. And it's something that I come across a lot when I'm working with local government GIS professionals or local government public safety folks, whether that's city, county, regional, or state, identifying how to move forward in a desired way does impact success. So Next Generation 9-1-1 introduces a massive cultural shift in how we communicate, manage data, and execute processes across a multi-departmental structure to support technological advancement. So Drew, what does that mean, right? You guys are looking at that. It sounds really intelligent, right? And yes, I did write this. It's important to identify everything along the pathway that is going to be impacted when we start talking about integrating and migrating to Next Generation 9-1-1. It's not only in data. It's not just a change in how the data looks or how the data is managed. It's how we communicate back and forth with each other, whether that's a dispatcher or a call taker or a PSAP director to a GIS technician or a GIS manager or GIS director. We have to think about everybody else that's involved in that process. Who all is affected by a change in the data? We have to be able to communicate that extremely well. And then we have to be able to execute those processes across a multi-departmental structure. That's any of our organizations, right? We're not a single solitary department that sits in any organization. We're multi-departmental because of who we serve. We serve the community. So who's involved in that multi-departmental structure? Parks and Rec, planning, community development, your fire, law enforcement, police, all those guys, your first responders. Who else? I mean, it could be somebody just as far as left field that you're not even thinking about, like the library or the schools who are leveraging your data for some sort of action or some sort of business process that they have. And if you start changing the data without telling them, it could create another one of those roadblocks for you that's going to impact how successful you are moving forward. So we have to think without blinders on when we start thinking about this migration to Next Generation 9-1-1. And that's how we manage the change, because we've thought about all of this stuff. Right, so here's kind of a workflow diagram that I found that I think really identifies this level of thinking or this thought process that is really helpful. So when we talk about change management for Next Generation 9-1-1, we have to think about data. We just identified that there's a change in data management, how data is collected, how data is distributed, how data is communicated across a multi-departmental structure, right? That's inevitable. We all get that. But how we plan for this change is going to really impact how successful we are as well, right? So any successful venture requires careful planning before we start, because if not, we potentially will miss steps along the way and have to backtrack. And if we're taking steps backward, we're not moving forward. Or as any of my GIS professionals know, and you've had to work in some sort of data, building a data schema, if you don't do it right the first time, regardless of how much effort you've put into it, you have to start all over again, and that can be disheartening. Well, you don't want to change this big to be disheartening. You want it to be successful along the way. And that's why building a solid team around you and understanding who that team is really going to help you with that planning process and with the data communication process. So who needs to be at the table to help you make some of these decisions? This can't be a decision that's made in a silo. It can't be made at GIS only. It can't be made at 9-1-1 only. Who else in the game? That's sorry about that, guys. So engage. You really want to engage your team. You want to engage the community. So not only do we want to engage and communicate internally, but there's a massive need here to also communicate externally. So do we have an opportunity to engage the public and let the public know what's going on with 9-1-1? Because I promise you, the majority of public, regular public, doesn't know about 9-1-1. They know that when they need help, they dial 3 numbers, someone picks up, and help comes. What if there's a lag or a fault in any of those processes or any of those steps? There's no other number that we've been trained since we were children to call. It's 9-1-1. So can the public help us be successful in our migration to NG9-1-1? Maybe yes, maybe no. A lot of it's going to depend on the culture that you have in the community that you're in. You also want to really engage your team, the team that you build, because whether you're GIS or 9-1-1, there's no expectation that you, as one person already wearing a ton of hats, is going to be required to know everything possible about a transition or a migration to Next Gen 911. That's why you have a team around you so that you can all bring your own backgrounds, your unique experiences and expertises to the table. So engage that team and trust that team and build together with that team and identify a pathway of execution. What are the 1, 2s, and 3s to go from A to B? And along the way, have markers or key performance indicators to help you measure the success of that transition and celebrate those successes, because that's what's going to help us long-term show improvement, which is why we really want to get into anything that requires change management so that we can measure success and that we can track improvement, right? Well, if you're not doing that from the beginning, is it easier to come in the middle of the process to start identifying these key performance indicators or these key measures? Maybe yes, maybe no. I don't know how you operate, but start thinking about it as you're having these conversations, thoughts, or discussions around next generation 911. All right, so a quick overview about NG9-1-1 and understanding why there's a need to change. I know this is going to be repetitive for a lot of folks, but I like to throw this in here because I don't know everybody that's in the room. All right, so on the left side, we have what is a current state E911 process, right? So workflow. So you have your ALI and your MSAG, right? You have your database that's tracking your landline phone connectivity and your database that's tracking your road centerline ranges. And then you have your 911 database. That's how 911 calls are routed. And that's really what we're moving away from and moving to what's on the right side to this spatial interface that's going to now have our GIS data and operating geospatial call routing through our location validation function and our emergency call routing function. So that's a massive change in itself, right? We can understand that. But it's a bigger impact on GIS because while we identify and acknowledge that we have an MSAG and we have an ALI, these are tabular databases. And because they're tabular, it means they do not store geospatial information. They store information about location, but you can't geocode it. So that's a massive change. And it's a big change for us as GIS professionals because it's now pulling us into a workflow and a process that traditionally we haven't had to operate in. I love this because it's a new challenge for me as a GIS professional, but I don't necessarily know immediately how it works because I've never been a part of the process. So this is where communication, understanding, and education is going to be important for me as a local government GIS professional, and where I'm going to look to you, the 911 community or the public safety community, to help educate me on how you specifically are using geospatial data now versus how you're going to be using geospatial data in an NG9-1-1 environment and how we can work together to get where we need to be. Right, and then standards. Oh gosh, there are so many standards, right? This is a massive change for both public safety. Well, not really for public safety because you guys have been dealing with standards for a long time as it relates to 911 and public safety. But for GIS folks, these are a lot of standards that we're now being written into, like the GIS data model, NG9-1-1 data management requirements, synchronizing GIS databases with MSAG and ALI. While that's a legacy standard, I can't say that that's something I've ever operated in the 15 years that I was in local government. So again, change. We're identifying change throughout each slide that's going to be impactful for how successful we are moving forward. Now, preparing for change. We've identified that we need to change or a change is going to occur, and it could have a lot of effects on our culture, on our processes, on our workflows. So how do we prepare for it? And this is where it gets fun for me. So 5 years ago, I was introduced to this acronym. I know you're looking at me, you're like, Drew, really? Another acronym? Yes, A.D.K.A.R. Awareness, Desire, Knowledge, Ability, and Reinforcement. Now, this is a PROSCI, P-R-O-S-C-I, methodology for change management. And this is the one that has stuck well for me because I can take any decision-making process, either as a GIS manager, as a leader, as a thought leader, as a communicator, I can put any of those processes into this acronym and know that if I miss any of these steps or I don't follow through with any of these steps, I increase at a higher rate the risk of failure or not completion to success where I'd like to be, right? So awareness of the need to change. So why are we changing? Desire to support the change. All this happens locally, right? You can build awareness, but if you don't build desire, you're not going to change. Knowledge of how to change. You can build awareness. You can have the desire because you see the benefits and the impact, but if you don't know how to do it, you're not going to do it. You're going to revert back to what you know. Ability to demonstrate skills and behavior for change, right? If I don't have the ability to change, I have the knowledge of how to do it. I really want to do it because I know it's going to be better for me, but I don't have the ability. Ability could be not having the technical ability to do it, not having the process to do it, not having the support that I need to do it, the technological advancements that I need to do it. Maybe there's a certain tool or a certain workflow process that I'm not aware of, or a certain toolkit. That's ability. Ability is not personal ability, although it could be, but more likely it's something technical that you don't have, a certain license level of something, a machine that will support the geoprocessing that's required to make those changes happen. So don't think of ability as you not having, like physically being unable to do it, because you do. If you have the desire, you have the knowledge, and you have the ability, but you lack reinforcement to make those changes, again, it's going to fail. So you can see why this A.D.K.A.R. A.D.K.A.R is an extremely important process for developing successful change management for anything, and in this case, specifically for next generation 911. Because if you miss or you skip or you don't dig deep enough into any one of these steps, it's going to be easy to just say, not that important. Now we're going to dive into each of these by themselves. So now what? How does this actually relate to NG9-1-1? And I'm going to use an example that I've seen happening all across the country so that it's something that we can relate to. So awareness, how do we create the awareness to change? Or how do we create awareness for next generation 911? Well, we have to provide the evidence that's required to determine if or what kind of change is necessary or not. And for GIS and understanding a level of effort for GIS data, the best way to do that is through some sort of data health assessment or level of understanding or gap analysis. I know there are a lot of states that are in the process of doing gap analysis right now and have over the past several years. What a great place to start. And I say that's a great place to start because we've talked about NG9-1-1 for 10 years, maybe longer. Somebody correct me if I'm wrong in thinking that it's only 10 years. It may be closer to 15, but we saw a slow roll on this integration of NG9-1-1. I know specifically in the GIS community, we've talked about it for that long. And every year I kept waiting for something to happen and it didn't happen. So the further and further away we got from excitement, the less likely we were to act on it. So that's where taking something that I'm extremely familiar with as a GIS professional, which is my data, and performing a health assessment or a gap analysis or a level of understanding for what it's going to take to get my data from its current state to where it needs to be to not only support next generation 911, but to support the public safety community. While there are some things that are identified that I can do, like identify a duplicate address point or identify if I have a mismatched order along a road center line, I need a more holistic view because at this point, I don't know what I don't know. So that's where this health assessment is really going to level the playing field for me and build that awareness to say, I need to change. Because I guarantee you, if you've never had a health assessment done, tell you what, I'm going to rephrase that a little bit. GIS professionals are very proud of what they do. I'm very proud of what I do, and I'm very proud of the effort that I've put into and my team have put into managing geospatial data for my city, my county, my state, or my region. Right? So it's going to be hard for me to look objectively at my data because I put so much time and energy and effort into managing that data. The last thing I want is for somebody like me as a vendor or you as a 911 professional or another GIS professional telling me that my data is wrong. It's going to be really hard. Let me know if you guys have had those conversations because I have, and they can be fun, but oftentimes they can be tense. This is a great way to level set that conversation and level the playing field because it's backed by evidence, right? You have a percentage that you're trying to hit and you're not to that percentage. We can now plan to move forward. So creating awareness is extremely important when it comes to involving GIS and building a need to move towards next generation 911, right? But you also need to create awareness internally and externally. So you need to educate cross-departmental. You need to identify the data supply chain. So where's data coming from? Where's it going? Who manages it? Who edits it? Who's going to be impacted by these changes or the results of an anomaly report or a gap analysis? And then identify important players moving forward. So who needs to be at the table to help you make the decisions that need to be made moving forward? This is also going to create some accountability within your organizations that will encourage you to continue move forward. As I stated earlier, a lot of this can't be done in a silo. Nearly none of it can be done in a silo. That's why you have to build your team and engage within your team. But creating that awareness is really going to help provide the motivation that you need to move forward. All right, so we've got our awareness. We've got the results of our gap analysis. Now what? What's your next step? You're going to review the gap analysis to understand the level of effort that you need to get data where it needs to be. Are the results what you expected? Sometimes, yes, I have worked with folks that were like, yeah, it's exactly where I thought it was going to be. And others like, had no clue I needed to do more, or I had no clue these are the types of things that were going to be tested against or looked at. So that helps create desire. So first you have awareness, now you have the desire to move forward because you can see a path forward, you can see where you need to make change so that you can get where you need to be. But how? How do you actually do that though, right? If I have the results, it's not what I wanted, how do I build desire? Through knowledge. So some important things to think about as you start moving forward, because you have awareness and you have the desire, is start thinking about how you can actually execute this plan. You need to think about funding, whether it's grants, your current budget cycles, etc., federal funding. Start planning all of this stuff into it. So develop a strategic plan for moving forward that identifies how you're going to communicate cross-departmentally, how you're going to maintain the data moving forward, because that could be a significant change for you, how you're going to correct errors as they're identified in the process. So data management, who manages what piece of the data that you need, which also comes back to data supply chains, right? And then resources, do you have the resourcing available to execute this plan at a high level? And this is not just for you, right? You're building this knowledge base for your entire team because each one of us have a question. And to address just knowledge without first building awareness of desire, or at some point building awareness and desire, you may not be able to execute as well as you think you'd like. But knowledge is extremely important. But knowledge mixed with ability can be very, how can I say this? Knowledge mixed with ability can be dangerous and head you down a path that you're not necessarily ready for, right? So when I think about ability, and I talk about ability for folks that have everything that they need to execute the way that they want to execute, right? GIS professionals know how to build feature data sets. We know how to build geodatabases. We know how to build ETL processes. We can run data validations in some of our desktops environments. So you may look at the results of your gap analysis or the results of any plan that you've put together and say, you know what? I'm pretty capable. I have pretty good ability, and my video keeps cutting out. I apologize, guys. Let me get that fixed for you. There we go. So you may head down this path of where you start building internal processes to support aspects of data maintenance and data management and data validations that are going to help you execute faster. I will warn you, as you start heading down this path, you start getting into a field of dreams mentality, or at least your community can get into a field of dreams mentality, because as you start creating things that are really cool and they're really fun and people see that you have the ability to do this stuff, you may start getting stretched and pulled into different directions to build this really cool process or build this really cool app or build this really cool thing or that thing. And it's going to pull you further away from really where you started. So building tools and building processes is really cool, but be careful what you wish for, be careful what you ask for, be careful what you produce, because you don't want to get to a point where you can no longer support what you originally were intended to support or what you originally wanted to support. So be careful with ability, but execute where you can and execute at a high level if that's going to help you move forward. So think about data quality and this ability, right? Is all of the data available that you need so that you can build your tools and build your processes? Is all the necessary data present? So think back to data supply chain. Who is managing your road center lines? Who's managing your address points? How often do they update data? Does it reflect the real world, or is it theoretical versus actual road ranges? Does every point represent a house, or do you have multiple points that represent different features on your map? So these are questions that you really need to ask during this process that's going to help fill out your ability to execute these processes at a high level. How often is it updated? Are you getting it often enough to keep your processes updated enough? Is it managed, updated, and duplicated in a way that it not only supports your existing business systems for GIS that you distribute to the rest of your community, but will it also support the timelines needed for 911? Again, remember, we have our team, we're communicating, we're pulling other people into the process because we're operating without our blinders on, so that we make sure we're touching everything that we need to touch to support now all the people that we need to support. And this can get very GIS centric, but understand some of the data you're using may not come from GIS. It could come from the state, it could come from different departments. And then staffing patterns will really affect your ability to execute some of these processes. Whether you are a shop that has no GIS and you're using a vendor to support your data management, your data updates, build that into the process, build that into the plan. Maybe you're one of the folks earlier that raised your hand as the only GIS person in your shop, but you operate GIS as a secondary function. So you're a planner or you're a surveyor, but you also know how to make maps and manage data. How does now supporting next generation 911 and participating in these conversations and these new workflows going to impact your primary role against your secondary role? If you're a single GIS person, do you have the ability to now support what's needed in this process? And as an enterprise department where you have multiple staff, how do you distribute functionality against your department? That's a really good question and can really impact how you move forward and how successful you are moving forward. All right, let's go back to ability one more time. So strategic planning will be extremely important. Improved knowledge of systems and data is going to really help you along the path as you build your strategic plans and fill out your ability to support next generation 911 in this transition. And then data management practices now versus for next gen really need to be built into that plan as well. You have to identify that stuff early, or if not, you're going to get into the process and figure out something's missing, you forgot something, you missed something. So start thinking holistically about the processes you're currently running versus how that may change as you start executing next gen 911. This is the most important piece of this entire presentation: reinforcement. We often forget about reinforcing why the change is necessary. And we forget that because once we've gotten to the reinforcement aspect, we're done before we get there, right? We've developed our plans, we've developed our processes, we've started executing, we're on a path forward, but at some point along the way, we forget to remember why we're doing it and reinforce the why behind it. And because we do that, it's easy to revert back to what you know, right? You spent a ton of time putting together this, I'll tell you, something I see a lot of are states that have put together these statewide data sets that require a ton of management and a ton of local government engagement. And at some point along the path, it's not reinforced of why that's done, because we get so busy wearing the multiple hats that we wear and supporting what we're supporting that we forget that that's out there and we forget it exists. Well, for next gen, it's going to be really important that we remember internally and externally why we're making these changes and who they're supporting. We also need to acknowledge that change is difficult, and this is going to take time. It's not a change that can happen overnight. It's not a change that can happen in a month or even a couple of years. As someone who has managed change from E9-1-1 to next generation 911, the data component of our process took us 2 years to address. Right, so it does take time, but you need to acknowledge that change takes time. And as long as you have a plan that you can fall back on and that you can use as a reinforcement method, your rate of success is going to be higher. And acknowledge what small steps you can take. This is that measure of success that we talked about earlier. What are those steps, and can you celebrate those steps? Because that's going to help you build on reinforcement. Creating these feedback loops, creating public visibility around these changes and why you're making these changes, and then celebrate the wins. Celebrate small wins, celebrate large wins, communicate constantly with each other, right? As standards change, as you identify someone that's really successful in this new environment, identify that and celebrate it and communicate it. Share responsibility. Shared responsibility is going to be really important moving forward with next generation 911 and building for that change. And then make sure you have that level of understanding across departmental of why these changes are occurring. All right, and then I want to take a little step back, because this is part of reinforcement. This is identifying the who, what, when, where, how often, and why, is understanding that data supply chain. This is a little diagram that I found that really breaks down that data lifecycle a little differently. And excuse me, depending on how your organization operates, this may be one person, this may be multiple people, but identifying who creates the data is going to be important, and what pieces of data they create, how that data is processed, how you're going to accomplish the review and the reporting and usage aspect of your data, especially as you get into next gen 911 with identifying anomalies within the data, because you'll have to work this back, right? Not forward, but backwards, as you identify anomalies within the data so that you can get it back to the person that owns it and edits it and creates it. Identify their or your retention and retrieval process. If you're the only GIS person, this is very easy for you because you're the only one with the keys. But if you have other people that are responsible for different pieces of data, that could be a little more difficult and expand what that data supply chain looks like. And then really identify if data is destructed. I know as GIS professionals, the delete button is a really bad button for us. I know we've all accidentally hit it before. But I should have rephrased destruction into move to archive layer, because that could be the same thing. Do you take address points and move them to an archive layer? Do you have a retired address point layer or a retired road name layer? That could be important in the beginning steps of this data validation process, or understanding what data can be used to support next gen, because it can be a comparative piece of data as you're building that wholeness or that completeness of your data. But if you have that layer and I don't know it exists, I don't know that I can use it as a comparison resource. So think about the data supply chain and the data lifecycle when you're doing your planning for NG9-1-1. I think it's going to really help you address the who, what, where, when, how often, and why. It's going to be really important. And then repetition, and then reinforcement becomes a repetitive process. It's not a one and done. None of this is one and done, but specifically with data reinforcement, it's cyclical, right? So data validations that are going to be run to provide the continued visibility and accuracy profile of our data, that happens recurring. It's not one and done. Data remediations are correcting anomalies within our data. While that may start big and get small as we continue to run validations and continue to remediate our data over and over again, it's still a process we need to run. We know there's always going to be something that we have to fix because we're human. And at the end of the day, we've all fat fingered an F or a G at some point in time. We need to be able to see that. We also are going to maybe possibly continue to deal with legacy issues year after year as they become more known and more seen, or we're taking things away from being an acceptable anomaly to an anomaly that we're going to change. And our data management processes, we already know this. We already know that they're cyclical. It's something that we do every day, every week, every month, every year. How often we do it may change. So preparing for that change is going to be important as well. And then how we manage our data moving forward, and who are you going to bring in additional resources to help you manage aspects of your data for supporting next generation 911, as well as providing continued support for your existing business or your business practices. That's a good one. So this is actually my last slide. I took this last slide and kind of put it together because I thought it framed the stages of change really well when it came to A.D.K.A.R. Right, so if we're going to look at our current state, and that data, that GIS data health assessment is our current state, providing the awareness that we need for change, and also helping build the desire to participate in and support that change. That fits perfect. So that's awareness and desire, right? That's what I identified early. If you wanted to use A.D.K.A.R to build this change management methodology, that's a great place to start because it does help you build awareness and understanding where your data is at, and also help provide that desire that you need to want to change. And then using that to build a strategic plan for next generation 911 is that transition process from where we currently are that's going to be that A and B plan to get us where we want to go in the future, right? So that's building knowledge and ability. So we have the awareness and desire over here where we currently are, but we know to transition, we need more knowledge, and we need to identify if we have the abilities to do that. So it requires knowledge on how to change and the ability to implement the required changes using what we learned from that health assessment. And then as a future, that reinforcement, we're going to have the ability to run those GIS data validations, or the continued reminder of why we need to do this, right? Remembering back to, gosh, it happens so much. I mean, so much, please forgive me. I know it doesn't happen so much, but we can find examples of misrouted calls in the newspaper. You can go down to your PSAP and find an example of a misrouted call. That's kind of a reminder. That's a reinforcement for me on why I need to execute my job as a GIS professional really well to ensure that that doesn't continue to happen. Is there a guarantee that moving into next generation 911 means that that's not going to happen in the future? No, it doesn't, because we're human at the end of the day. But it is that sense of reinforcement that I need to remind me why I'm doing this, right? So that's A.D.K.A.R put into this state of change for this very, very, very GIS, very simply focused methodology of transitioning from where you currently are and developing a plan and a path forward for next generation 911. All right, guys, I hope we do have time for some questions. If you guys have any questions about change management in general, or if you want me to point you to some more resources about change management, you've got my information here. This is my email and my number. Please reach out to me. I'd love to meet you guys. I'd love to talk to you guys. I'd like to know if this was something new that you've been introduced to that maybe sparks your interest a little bit. Again, as I stated earlier, A.D.K.A.R is something that I've held on to for about 5 years. I've done some research into it. You can actually become a PROSI certified instructor, and the ability to figure out how to manipulate or put any action or any process into this change management methodology does require a lot of thought, but I think sets you up well for success because you're thinking without blinders on, and you're thinking about everything that's around you and how it could be impacted. So we do have about 6 minutes left. If you guys have any questions, please go to the chat window or the Q&A, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you guys have. And if we don't have any questions, I'm happy to give you guys back 6 minutes of your day as well. All right, and not seeing any questions coming in, guys, I really appreciate you hanging out with me. Please come back in what's now going to be 15 minutes for our next presentation. If you guys want to come back and hang out with me, I'll be back here in an hour, and we will talk about understanding the impacts of a 3 business day turnaround, which is really going to dive deeper into the number of days that's being presented as a requirement by NINA for fixing anomalies within your GIS data. I'm not sure if we're going to send out copies of the presentation. I've got a question. If you can get a copy of my presentation, feel free to send me an email. I'm happy to shoot out my presentation to you. If you want a copy of this, please take down my email, shoot me one. Happy to send it to you. Have no problem with that. You'll also get a link for a replay for this in our YouTube channel as well. All right, guys, I thank y'all very much for hanging out with me. We'll see you back here in an hour, or see you in about 15 minutes for the next show. See you guys.